So with that, just a quick overview. The agenda. I'm going to kick it off and just present a little bit of context, talk about some market trends. The bulk of the webinar today is going to be featuring our customer panel with security executives from Boreal Pipelines, Invista, which is a Koch Industries company, and Berkshire Hathaway Energy. And then we're going to feature the Dragos platform and a lot of the new capabilities that have recently been released. And we'll do that. Like I said, it's going to take the bulk of the webinar. So please, if you have questions as we go, put them in. We'll follow up with you. So with that, in terms of trends, lots of executive conversations about digital transformation, enabling Industry 4.0. And the theme should really be around enabling secure digital transformation. The World Economic Forum recently put out a report talking about how industrial companies need to really balance the investment in digitizing operations, which we know have tremendous operational benefits, efficiency, improving continuity, but balance those investments with the fact that you can expect greater exposure to malicious cyber threats going forward. And so that balance is important. Gartner Group yesterday put out a press release talking about what they see in terms of the financial impact of OT cyber incidents. And they are saying that they expect it will be over $50 billion by 2023. So just 2 years out. We've all seen the headlines, certainly the first half of this year, that's kind of reinforcing those trends. So the theme, enabling secure digital transformation, is one we really want to focus on throughout. So that's part of the trend. Digitizing operations is happening. There's lots of investment there. There's increasing investment in cybersecurity, but it's not keeping pace. It needs to ramp up. And in terms of the threat landscape, as I said, we've seen lots of headlines this year, but there are also some stats that I wanted to refer to that kind of reinforce that. We're going to look at OT vulnerability trends, some of the data that we've seen in the first half of this year, which I'm actually comparing to the Dragos year in review report that we put out at the beginning of each year. The year in review report is an analysis of vulnerabilities, threat activity, and insights from our customer engagements. So a little snapshot of what's happening so far in the first 6 months of this year. What we're seeing is that OT vulnerabilities and advisories are being released at twice the rate of last year. That's a significant increase. Just some detail behind that. Vulnerabilities in the first half of this year, these are vulnerabilities reported by NIST in the National Vulnerabilities Database for OT. We're 793 so far versus 703 last year. Advisories, which are issued by vendors, you can see it's a little under 100% increase from last year. So that's concerning, and it points to the need to have that balanced investment that I was talking about before. Additionally, advisories are often error prone. They usually have errors. So far this year, and we report on OT vulnerabilities in their advisories. We often are reporting on errors, and then we're recommending mitigations. So far this year, 35% of advisories have had errors. It's a little down from the trend that we saw last year. It's also really important that advisories often come with or without a patch, and they, regardless whether they have a patch or not, lack mitigation advice. In an operational environment, even if you have a patch, you may not be able to implement it, and you're often looking for mitigation measures. So in the first half of this year, 85% of advisories did not have any mitigation advice, 64% last year. So all of that's to say, managing vulnerabilities in these trends is an important part of an effective cybersecurity program. And you can hear much more about that later when Chris Carlson, our VP of Product, is going to talk about the new capabilities in the Dragos platform. So that's a little bit of setting the stage. I'm going to turn it over now to Troy Roberts, who's the head of sales at Dragos, and he's going to introduce the customer panel. Take it away, Troy.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter. I appreciate that, and great intro. Just want to start by saying thank you to the customers that we have on the panel today, both for being great customers and partners, but also taking time out of their day. They've got busy lives to come help us with this customer panel. You just heard some of the stats that Peter was reading off, and it's a little concerning, right? When you see what 35% vulnerabilities are just flat error prone. We're seeing an increase in both volume and still a lack of other mitigations. And we also find here at Dragos that many of the vulnerabilities that are reported in operational environments are actually more severe than they're being reported by some of the other public forums. And so that's going to lead to some challenges. We've also got heightened awareness about protecting critical infrastructure. You can point to the most public events that we've seen with Colonial or Oldsmar or the Solar Winds event. All of those are the ones that make the headlines, but we all know that there's a lot more going on. And so this heightened awareness around protecting critical infrastructure, we think is actually good for the community. And talking to each one of our customers that are here with us today, that was echoed. So let me introduce our panelists and we'll jump into a little Q&A. And each one of these gentlemen will tell us a little bit about what they do in the companies that they represent. So we have James Sumter, who is our Vice President of IT Operations and Security at Boreal Pipelines. We have Sean Gerber, who's the CISO at Invista, a subsidiary of Koch Industries. And Michael Ball, who's the Vice President and Chief Security Officer at Berkshire Hathaway Energy. So James, let me start with you since you're there at the top of the list. Maybe just a little bit about what you do and a little bit about Boardwalk before we get into the panel.
Sure. Thank you very much, Troy. My name is James Sumter. I'm working for Boreal Pipelines, Vice President of Operations and Security in IT, and responsible for the OT security as well. Boreal Pipelines is a natural gas and liquids pipeline servicing states from the Gulf Coast region up into the Ohio region and laterals in between, about 15,000 miles of pipeline. Mostly transport and some liquids pipelines in the Louisiana area. I've been in this industry for about 30 years now, and specific to energy in the last 25 and specific to security in the last 10 years.
Awesome. Thank you for that, James. Sean Gerber, how about a little bit about you and what you do at Invista?
Yeah, so I'm the CISO for Invista, which is as you mentioned before, a subsidiary of Koch Industries. We are a chemical manufacturing company, and we've got manufacturing facilities all over the globe, from China, North America, and in Europe. We are one of the largest manufacturers of certain chemicals that we deal with within this space. My background, I've been in security now going on right around 20 years. Started off as a Air Force commander for a red team and then migrated into working at Koch Industries. So I actually started flying military aircraft, so I had quite a diverse background when it came to that. And the part that I liked about was in the security space, and especially working with Dragos, it's actually been a very interesting and eye-opening experience.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Sean. Michael Ball?
Thank you. Just certainly serve as the Chief Security Officer for Berkshire Hathaway Energy, responsible for several domains: cybersecurity, physical security, and organizational resilience. A little bit about the Berkshire Hathaway Energy. We operate 10 locally run energy companies, serving across 28 states in the United States, with also operations in Canada and United Kingdom. These various companies provide electricity, transmission, distribution, gas operations, natural gas, and liquefied natural gas. So a large renewables portfolio at about 24,000 employees as part of the employee base, with 12 million customers served in those portfolio businesses. Contains about 210,000 miles of electric transmission distribution line, as well as 49,000 miles of gas transmission. So just kind of real diverse organization, but security and the concerns around security risk are prevalent across all of those organizations, and my responsibility is to lead that function.
Excellent. Thank you for being on, all three of you, this afternoon. And and just encouraged to see the leadership across multiple verticals here too. When we think about critical infrastructure, I know a lot of people immediately leap to the grid or to the electric vertical, but there's a lot of facets to that. You all are representing a diverse panel here. So you heard some of the stats that Peter just talked about, and I echoed. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in each of your organizations. And Sean, I'll start with you. When you think about the importance of visibility into your operational environment, and that's visibility on your assets, but also vulnerability management, how has that changed over time for Envista? And what are some of the challenges, or describe some of the challenges for me that you have with that?
Yeah, thanks, Troy. One of the things that we've dealt with in Vista, especially as it's migrated now, for you mentioned the digital transformation of our company, and that's been a big focus of Envista and Koch Industries as a whole, is how do we transform our companies? And as that transformation is occurring, we're learning a lot as we go. Many of our facilities were, in some cases, pretty autonomous, and now with this digital transformation, they are becoming more together, and therefore the threats are, instead of affecting one organization, they potentially could affect many. So that's been a big concern of ours, and not really having the visibility down in some of the areas that we want it to be was a big factor and a concern of ours. And especially being in the chemical industry space, it's imperative that we have good visibility, especially from a safety and reliability standpoint, as well as we're getting a lot of, there's a lot of pressure from outside organizations and outside regulatory aspects that are going to, that we have a due diligence to make sure that we have that visibility down in that space. So for us, it's a big concern, and we see it's only going to get more as time goes on. We see more and more legislation that's coming out, even with the Chinese cyber laws, to include what we're seeing in the United States, and then obviously additional aspects that are within the European Union as well. So to us, it's a huge factor, and it's something that we've got a lot of focus on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate you sharing that. James, any thoughts on, you think about the importance of visibility in your organization as well, and maybe some of the challenges that you have understanding, how to prioritize vulnerabilities or threats in your environment?
Yeah, Troy. Yeah, echoing what Sean said there. Obviously, there's a lot of legislation in the news today about critical infrastructure, security directives, and these types of things coming, which underscore the importance of keeping these systems up and running, and the safety and security of those systems. And one system, as you mentioned, Troy, the natural gas pipeline feeds as a fuel provider for electric grids and those types of things. So you have this cascading effect. So it's super important. But having visibility into the overall posture and health of the ICS is paramount. We need the ability to identify and remediate and detect, but more importantly, the capability that visibility brings to better understand and strategically improve these areas over time. It's not an overnight achievement, but we're looking at it as, what do we have today? How are we doing with it? And what do we need to do to change for tomorrow and to meet the security demands of the future? So, collecting threat metrics and gaining visibility into the industrial controls has always been a big challenge for our security teams in multiple industries. And the traditional vulnerability scanning systems pose a significant, risk to the temperamental nature of those industrial controls. So we have a huge focus right now on OT improvements and cybersecurity improvements within OT, and we're looking forward to seeing how the industry is going to change to meet that demand, both from a detection capability as well as a supply capability, supply chain capability.
Excellent. I appreciate you sharing that. And as you so rightly noted, that none of that is really unique to Boardwalk either. I'm sure there are a lot of people who are watching this right now who have that very similar experience and some of the same challenges. Michael, tell me a little bit about what you're faced with at Berkshire Hathaway Energy and how you're thinking about this whole, how do I protect my critical infrastructure?
Well, thank you, Troy. And just echoing some of the comments of my colleagues here, fundamentally, when visualization, visibility into our environments, understanding our asset base, understanding their posture at any given time ties into what I would characterize as important situational awareness, because a lot of these things are deliberate acts within our organization. How much do we build into our culture and expectations around understanding what our assets are. How do we embed that in the way we do business, such that when we are making changes, we're introducing new technology, we're building enhancements in automation. How does that situational awareness get bolstered through those work efforts? So in a world today where our threats become, we become aware of threats, we need to be able to understand all of our assets, what their posture is, be able to quickly assess our protections against those threats, be able to take quick action to mitigate those threats to the extent possible. And you can't do that without that fidelity and understanding our environments. And I think that's the great challenge for an industry that has been operating very effectively for a very long time without having to have necessarily that type of detail. So that's a transformation for all of us. And I think we're all facing that challenge. And I think we're also tackling that very much head on. So.
You touched on a lot there, Michael, that resonates, and I'm sure resonates with the audience. But a couple of things you said in particular was with a high level of fidelity and understanding how to prioritize what those threats are and how you're going to address those. So if you don't mind, I'm going to stay with you before I come back around to the other panelists. Today, how do you find, discover, and assess vulnerabilities? If you think about that whole lack of fidelity that we just talked about and some of the public alerting that's happening, how do you manage through that today?
So if you were to look at that diverse portfolio of businesses I highlighted earlier on, we have a wide degree of solutions in place that range from purpose-built technologies that help us in understanding environments to, I'd say, much more modern techniques, including some of our relationship, obviously, with Dragos, so that we're talking technology. But there's also, that ranges to other environments by which we're actually doing things manually. And when you do things that way, you don't have the ability to rapidly assess or verify a manual process. So we struggle. We're not where we want to be. And one of our, when I talk about how do we understand our posture, I'd say Colonial Pipelines is a great example. We always, when we have these industrial control system environments, we work really hard at making sure they're separate, that things that happen in the corporate IT environment don't have a direct impact. I think, but when you look at the interrelationship, the ecosystem that we depend on from a technology perspective to run our operations, a loss of services in the corporate IT environment. In the gas pipeline businesses, the scheduling and nomination system is a very vital part of operating that system. And when that goes away, we have to understand how that works. So again, rather than getting into some of the consequence management of it and some of the resiliency pieces of it, I'd really highlight that when those things happen, you got to know your environment. You've got to know and if you can't do that, you can't react quickly. And so I think that's our biggest challenge is we must know everything in our environment. We must know what that posture is. Where we have good tool sets, we need to leverage those more effectively. And that's really my mission and my challenge to our business, which is I want more comprehensive and unified visibility such that we can actually have response to situational awareness. We got to do that. It has to be part of the way we do our business.
Yeah, beautifully said too. And I think, the basis for any good vulnerability management program is you got to have good asset inventory and understand what you have in detail. And if you lack that visibility, then all the great knowledge that someone like Dragos may be able to bring to you around OT vulnerabilities doesn't really matter if you don't know what you have. So James, maybe back to you. Anything that Michael just said that might have triggered a thought for you on like the challenges of prioritizing vulnerabilities in this operational environment?
Well, certainly what Michael mentioned about asset inventory and visibility into what you actually have first, and then being able to manage from that inventory or that CMDB or asset list, whatever you've got. So that's one of the first challenges, is just discovering what you have. And is it reliable? And is it accurate? Can you work from it? But very traditionally, we've leaned on third-party reporting and information sharing platforms such as ISACs and ICS US CERT for the majority of our notifications on different vulnerabilities. Scan, like I said, mentioned earlier, scanning our ICS network was not necessarily a safe option in all cases. We've tried, we've used the tools before that have caused problems. So active scanning is not something that we feel comfortable with from a reliability perspective. But not having this information correlated and readily available means we lean on older traditional mitigations and protection methods to remediate those weaker systems, most of the time at the perimeter levels. And as everyone knows, the closer you get to remediate vulnerabilities at the actual control or device, the better it is. So we've leaned on a lot of traditional methodologies and a lot of field work, and we call drive the pipe or walk the pipeline to find and discover and get these devices remediated. So manual assessment processes means we delay remediations and down prioritize in a lot of cases. So that's something that we're changing.
Yeah, no, that's and that makes a lot of sense, and that just puts latency into the system, and you're not at best, even if you can get to a good state, you're certainly delayed in getting there. Sean, anything from those first couple of answers? Both really rich. Thank you, both of you. But anything that you want to add to that in terms of kind of how you think about the challenges and prioritization? And I think James just said it great. Being able to actually do something about it, even if you have the knowledge that you have vulnerabilities in your environment.
Yeah, they've all hit on everything that we've struggled with, from active scanning to knowing what you have in your environment. I'd say one other thing that we deal with is, to the point of the original question, is how are you alerted? So we do have automated processes in place for some of these things, but there also are manual. Like someone calls us up in the middle of the night and the server isn't responding for whatever reason, and that part you then have to go chase that fish. And we get to a point where knowing what is in our environment is awesome. We'll get to that level, but then it's also what's come out of everything that's happened with Colonial is it's now no longer an IT type issue. It's a business issue. And that nothing against our businesses at all, but being in IT for as long as I have, I've seen it where it's, hey, that's IT's problem. IT will work it out. But now when you have a situation where, like Colonial, it's impacting the business directly, we now, and because of the digital transformation that's going on, we are active partners with our operational folks. And that is a key factor, to include how do we do incident response? How do we respond to these? And do we have the right people to call? And do they know what to do? Have they gone through this process? Because you'll see that where, do you have a good business continuity or disaster recovery plan in place? And the person will look at them, well, yeah, we'll just go and grab that backup and we'll plug it in. Well, what are the impacts of that? And those are just conversations that have been very helpful and fruitful. And a lot of it, I know this is sales pitch for Dragos, but one of the things you guys have done really well with us is asking us some of these questions from the industrial side that you see with some of your other customers, which has been huge, just because, when you're in your own space, you have your blinders on what but getting insight from other customers that you have has actually made it very rich as far as when we have these conversations with our operational folks.
That's really great, and we appreciate the compliment. We'll take the unrequested sales pitch for Dragos, Sean. Thank you. So as we talk about what's coming up in the next section, there were a couple of things. I think, James, you were talking about leaning on some outside third-party resources for vulnerability information. We touched on the challenges with that. If the information is not good, or the only mitigation is a patch and you can't patch, like there's some challenges with that. And what you're going to hear about in the next section is what we can do with our Dragos platform, where you can manage the life cycle of specific vulnerabilities in your environment with a full historical disposition through continuous automated collection and analysis. And that kind of gets to the situational awareness that Michael was talking about. And the platform actually now has a vulnerability knowledge base that's been enriched by our ICS and OT SMEs. So those people that Sean was just talking about, where we have experience in these environments, have been asset operators, have been in this space for a long time. We actually can more accurately prioritize what to address, whether you need to do it now, next, or never, and also give you better guidance on mitigations outside of just patching. because patching, I appreciate the commentary around active scanning and patching both. Like, you're gonna have a hard time convincing someone that you won't do something to disrupt operations. And there's plenty of evidence with that. So I'll come back, Michael, to you. Thinking about what I just described will be in this next version of platform. How do you think that could change things in your environment if you now had the ability to continuously monitor and know that you could have faith in the vulnerability information that you're getting?
So thank you, Troy. I think, fundamentally it speaks to, the advanced capabilities we need to be able to have. Now, whether it, is a Dragos solution or another solution, the outcome is essential, which is the ability to understand our environment, to be able to recognize the inherent challenges, of the ICS environments, whether it be, the limitations and sensitivities of the particular, versions of any of the operational technologies, the systems we use, the third-party vendor relationships, where the dependency on their assessments and testing in those environments, they frankly bog us down, and we can't move at that speed anymore. So our ability to prioritize, to understand our environment, evaluate that, not just look at patches, but instead also be able to look at mitigations. And where do you go? Can I do one thing that protects many things versus try to go chase after many things and do none of it well? So I think that's what we got to be. I really applaud that vision and those organizations that can, that like all of ours, that really are trying to solve that problem. So we really appreciate that comment. But that's really my key view on that.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. I'll come back to you, James. You heard me describe a little bit about what we're putting into our platform to help solve this problem for you all, and think about what the impact might be to you if you were envisioning your world where you actually had timely information that was accurate and you actually had a kind of a continuous view of your vulnerability stance. What would that mean to you and to Boardwalk?
Well, and Michael hit on a great point. So one of the challenges is, when you see the vulnerabilities that you might have, or the vulnerability scan reports output from information like that, it can be quite overwhelming, and depending on some of these larger systems that span across the multi states and countries. But the Dragos platform that was recently released, shows us great promise in being able to prioritize where you need to heavy hit. When you first look at all the vulnerabilities that you might have in your environment, and then be able to pivot those together and summarize those into, what do I need to hit first? What gets me the most bang for my buck in terms of vulnerability remediation? It's a great platform for that, and the analysis that comes with it. It gives us deeper and more contextual advice, real advice that's tailored to how our system behaves, not just a flat report that applies to all industries and all devices, but having a Dragos analyst on board that goes well beyond the ICS cert advice and general advisories is very helpful. We need the ability to weight, assign, and upgrade or downgrade risks based on our own evaluation. And the Dragos platform, along with their analysts, helps us with, especially with the now, next, never method. And I'll also go to what Sean said. This has also provided a platform to help further build relationships between security, IT, and OT for us. We can all sit down at this data and discuss what, why, and how we're going to mitigate or remediate, and how we can put those into strategies for long term. So we can build those into our cyber-informed engineering as well. So we'd sit down with our engineering group and say, in the future, we've seen this particular vulnerability, and here's what it could cause, and how can we engineer around that? All right. So it's been a tremendous platform for us to get in and do analysis on. So we're really excited to dig in deeper and to expose those and get some help.
Great, really appreciate that. I think that's an important point that you were making there about even downgrading risk when you're more fully informed, because figuring out what not to spend time doing is just as important as what are the first things that you need to go address, because you're all living with limited staff, right? No one has unlimited resources. And so being able to point them in the right direction is critically important. So Sean, back to you, as you think about getting Dragos platform now on 1.8 with this vulnerability capability, How does that change things for you in terms of how you might go manage vulnerability and risk in your environment?
Yeah, so you guys have both, everybody's kind of touched on the same topic, but having people is a challenge, right? Especially when we have them spread across the globe. We only have a limited number of resources, and we all know in this market that it is today, finding good qualified people can be a challenge as well. And so therefore, knowing what to go work on with the limited resources we have is very valuable. The other thing is we're big in our risk philosophy, and the now, next, or never is really a huge factor, because in many cases, our leadership will come to us and they support what we want to do, but they ask, well, what's the risk? Well, instead of going, well, I know the risk, I think, but I really don't know. It's more definitive, and it's going to be very helpful for that. Now, obviously, you have to understand your environment to really know what is the risk, but this will be another indicator or another piece of information that'll help us make accurate decisions. And so we can use the resources we have in the most effective, manageable way. And I think that's, from our philosophy, that's the key factor. And we're not like the government. We can just go fix everything, and that still doesn't always work out well. And so therefore, I think this is a really good way for us to create a lot of value and to protect our OT environments.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'd love to hear too, James made a really, I think, insightful comment about this is part of how you can start to sit down with your friends in IT security and start to bridge that, what we would call the IT-OT gap, which we all know is not a technology gap, right? IT has been inside of operations for decades, but being able to find common ground to recognize that IT does have now good information about the impacts to critical infrastructure, and OT understands that there does need to be security controls. So maybe Michael, if you might want to just pick up on that string, because I think that's really, really important topic. Like, all the tech in the world doesn't solve for that, but this, if you can get to common language and common goals, I think that goes a long way. And I think this is a tool in your bag to do that.
Yeah. Thank you, Troy. And I think, that the conversation leads to, that spectrum of security, from knowing your environment, understanding the risks into it, and then being able to respond. And I don't think you could ever assert you could effectively do that without those elements in place, as well as the ability to coordinate and communicate across teams. I'll maybe illustrate it in a way, when I look at it, is it really around, as much as we can do to prevent the likelihood of an event happening, mitigate risks and vulnerabilities, we also need to be monitoring for evidence or any indication that we may see that threat being realized. And so when you have, however you're structured with like a security operations, global security operations, we have, I think understanding the environments, having that fidelity across the organization, and then know how to contact. So traditional IT security, global security operations would, in fact, when they see an issue, they go to the people that know the systems, that touch the buttons. That has traditionally been IT technologists. Well, in the operational technology world, obviously you'll have some technologists there, but oftentimes it's your operators that know when an alert is something to be worried about, or whether it's something that actually is expected and is understood. And that 2 to 3 way communication needs to be able to happen. It won't happen with silos. It will not happen with silos. And if we have those, the OT and IT divide, that oftentimes is very passionate, and they have their own castle walls and moats, and you don't cross them, right? And we have to overcome that as an organization. And frankly, that speaks to culture, and culture has to start at the very top. And that culture is not even about the technology, but it's about the outcomes we need to achieve and how we need to operate. So I would really hone in that we have to break down those barriers. If we have them, and we will have them, we got to continue to drive those down and have much more fluid communication and situational awareness, regardless of the technology stack or who owns it.
Yeah, could not agree more, Michael. Well said. Sean, anything you want to add to that particular string we're pulling on? Because again, I thought it was just a really good comment by James and really great follow-up by Michael. But anything you'd add to that? Because having lived through this with you now for a little bit, have seen you working on the IT-OT boundaries coming together, and I think your insight would be helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Troy. We have been, that has been a thing in the past that we've struggled with, is around the communication between the IT and OT environments. And we have we had in the past, we've had one guy, and this one guy knew everything about OT, and everybody went to him on this. But now what's happened with Dragos is we've been able to now spread that, I say the wealth, because as we turned it on, as an example, we had a situation where it found a bunch of networks that we had, and we went to this one guy, and he said, well, yeah, those are all the networks, but nobody else really understood all those networks. And so now we had the visibility with, instead of just one person who knows it all, we had the ability of have others that are in the IT environment that can actually understand that network. So it was been very helpful, and that just from a visibility standpoint as well.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to give each of you a moment here at the end to just may add any final thoughts that you have. We've got a couple or 3 minutes left, and really go in any direction you like rather than me prompting you. But excuse me, just want to say thank you, not just for being on the panel, but also for what you guys are doing in your day-to-day lives with your teams and actually protecting the infrastructure that creates products for us, that fuels our homes, that keeps the lights on, keeps water clean. These are actually really important things. Like, I'd like my grandkids to have clean water and electricity and clothes and things. So let me just, I'll come around to each of you. Any final thoughts that you have, I would welcome. So James, I'll start with you.
Yeah, Troy, again, the IT-OT gap is super important. It goes back to culture, like Michael said, and what Sean reiterated. We started with, we kicked off our gap remediation, if you will, with a training, a week-long workshop training session with Dragos, where we had a 50-50 split of IT-OT staff, most of which had never met before. And so it was a wonderful opportunity to build bridges there. The IT person would say, well, look what I can do. And the OT person would say, well, let me show you how this works in my world. And so it was very eye-opening, and everyone came out of there just with a whole new respect for one another and what their capabilities are. And I think that's where you start with something like this. But the Dragos platform gives us a common view that we can all look at and work from, that shows for the OT folks that the IT folks now understand and see what's going on out here. And for the OT folks, here's the IT security team is looking at all these vulnerabilities that are now exposed that we may not have known before. So it's been a good journey, and it's one that we're going to continue down.
Awesome. Thank you for that, James. Michael, over to you. Any final thoughts?
I think I'd probably hit on two things. One is just kind of, again, hitting on, culture, that, the culture of an organization starts at the very top. The CEO, all the top executives have to push this down the organization, where security and our security focus is built into the ecosystem of how we operate and serve our customers. We have to thrive in serving our customers, but our culture, it's no longer security discipline in a back office in a room where you got people looking at data. You really have to build that in. I think that's something that is part of breaking down the barriers, stopping the cultural divides that have been in place, and really be able to work together, because I think that's the key, is working outside those silos. I would actually take that to another piece, and that's really partnerships, is that same mentality has to extend beyond our own organizational boundaries as well. We have a really interesting and amazing and rich community of practitioners. If we solve the problem in one area, then we should be able to, if we have a problem, maybe a better way to approach it, that there's probably somewhere in our relationships where that problem's been solved. We should learn from each other. The partnerships, whether it be Dragos or other third parties, our relationships with government, understanding the issues and sharing that so that we can be resilient, not just as a company, but and the services we provide, but as an industry, and then and the communities we serve. And I think that's really our big challenge. We've got a lot of work to do there, no question about it. But I'm also very encouraged by, whether it be this dialogue or many others we get in, by which we're sharing practices and leveraging expertise amongst ourselves.
Really well said, and thank you, Michael. And a couple of things that you all said about interacting with others in the community. would be another great topic for another discussion sometime, but we could talk about Neighborhood Keeper quite a bit and how the community can help itself get better and have better situational awareness and remove some of that latency from the system. But thank you again, Michael. Sean, any final thoughts for us before we send it back over to Peter?
Yeah, just that I appreciate you having this opportunity for us to chat. One thing it's happening now more than ever in the OT environment. We all have to pay attention to this. We were actually going through within Koch Industries, we have a risk organization, and working with our risk organization, we figured out from our decision, how do we go forward with the Dragos platform? And one of the aspects was around, well, how often does this kind of thing happen? And this was before we started, before the news hit, right, of all these past events. And the conversation was, well, I think it's maybe once every 100 years it'll hit. As you're working through the Monte Carlo scheme, right? And as we're going through that scenario, I go, no, it's probably like once every 50, as we're going through this. And then all of a sudden, bam, 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 it hits. And you're like, okay, well, maybe we need to readjust our thought process around risk. It just comes down to is this environment is going to be a target. And it just because it's got financially motivated people are. And unfortunately, it can also hurt a lot of people. So it's important that we do take a emphasis on this and a focus on it and make sure that we do break down those barriers, as the other gentlemen have mentioned, and focus on protecting this environment. So that's about all I've got.
Great. Thank you for that, Sean. And look, I think you heard some common themes here when you started talking about situational awareness. You heard a lot of commentary around visibility, trying to be able to get high fidelity in your vulnerability information so that you know what to do, what not to do, and how to manage that risk. And having common vernacular and even technology that allow you to bring IT and OT together. So really great themes throughout. I think what you're going to see here next from the product itself and what we have coming out in 1.8 will touch on some of those and many others. So again, thank you to the panelists. Sincerely appreciate you all being customers and protectors of our critical infrastructure. Peter, I will send it back over to you.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you, James, Michael, and Sean. Really appreciate that. So before we turn it over to Chris Carlson to go over the platform and some of the new capabilities, I wanted to talk quickly about what is the Dragos difference? What's the difference about Dragos and our technology? And the answer is it's our people. And while we have a services organization that I think is one of the best in the world, our entire team at Dragos, we have the largest ICSOT practitioner team in the market, and that's terrific. And we invest heavily in taking the expertise of our people, which is in many dimensions. It's in ICSOT, as well as we have deep industry domain experience in many areas, and codifying that into the platform. So the reputation that we've been building around what we know about industrial cybersecurity is absolutely kind of built into the platform. And we wanted to show you kind of who are these people. These people make a big difference. We just came through the MITRE Ingenuity evaluation for ICS, and we think we did extremely well. There's a couple of blogs on our website if you care to take a look at that. That is all due to the people that build the technology that we deliver to our customers. So let's play. We have a short video just to show you who are these people and how does their know-how get put into the platform. Might take a second here to get it up.
I'm one of the few people on Earth who does cybersecurity incident response to critical infrastructure systems. And that could be anything from oil and gas to electrical to manufacturing, aviation, trains. And we also use that knowledge that we gain from doing a lot of incident response and collecting a lot of threat intelligence to improve our product.
My work and the team's work at Dragos and threat intelligence really drives the core element of the Dragos platform, which is the uncovering of malicious activity operating against industrial environments.
We'll add different mitigations, like if you can't patch, what else can you do? And we will just provide our own risk assessment. We'll correct CVSS scores. we do that entire assessment, and each one of those as we assess them get added into the platform.
We codify our experiences and what we've seen kind of through our career, and we kind of bake that into the Dragos platform.
My role is primarily around working with our intelligence and professional services teams to codify all of their findings and expertise into analytics within the Dragos platform. That way we can make it available to all of our platform customers across the world.
We do a retrospective on our services engagement, and the outcome of that actually feeds back into our product. That's not only coming from us being in the field, but it's also us listening to the customers as well.
Great. I hope that gives you some idea of the kind of expertise we have in the company and how that gets translated into the platform. But now it's time to turn it over to Chris Carlson, and he'll give you kind of a update on all the new cool stuff that's in the platform. Chris.
All right, thank you, Peter, for that. And just to check, do you see my slides so we can go forward? So I want to start and thank you for the panelists. The information was fantastic. I started taking notes and then I ran out of ink. So for those that are on the webinar, this recording and the presentation will be available to you after the fact. And for those of you that are asking questions in both the chat and QA, keep them coming. We are answering them as they come in. We won't have time for a live response, but we will follow up with you afterwards on those questions. So what I want to go through for my session before we finish up is the updates on the Dragos platform. So we release many times a year, and this is a really big update for us for the platform. I want to go through some key areas. And a lot of it really has reinforced what the panelists have talked about in their terms and the need for visibility around vulnerability management, of course. And then that pesky term of IT-OT convergence, or maybe OT-IT boundary traversals is one thing as well. So from a Dragos platform point of view, this is really not a platform overview. We can schedule some time with you that want to have more details, but it's a cybersecurity set of hardware and software that's deployed in your environment. We have passive sensors that monitor your OT and ICS networks, and we give you those capabilities around asset visibility and inventory, threat detection on top of adversary or including inadvertent changes in your environment, that investigation and response capabilities. And then what's new in this release is the vulnerability management capability. And as Peter talked about, a lot of the platform capabilities are codified with the Dragos people. So the threat intelligence, the ICS OT expertise, the control process engineers for coming into the knowledge pack that goes into the Dragos platform. So for this release, and I'm really thrilled and excited to go over this with you all. In fact, this is our public unveiling of the most recent update to the Dragos platform. A couple of areas. Number one is updates for performance for our visual interactive map. The reason why that's important is as our customers start to expand the Dragos platform across their entire environment, not just your most critical assets and locations, but total visibility across their ICS and OT. That scalability is something which they're counting on for the Dragos platform. Updates and changes for our Asset Explorer and moving it into a true asset inventory and lifecycle management. That was an important thing that came up during the panel today, and also the new vulnerability management capabilities. So from a platform view of the interactive map, so the ability for this release to scale to hundreds of thousands of assets. So having them in one long list is one way to manage your asset inventory, but how can you see how they actually physically map into your environment, how they relate to each other and their communications, and then do that cross-sensor and cross-site visibility of your entire operational environment. And what we offer in the Dragos platform is not only that point in time, but also that snapshot historical view to go back like a digital video recorder and look backward in time of what happened last Tuesday or 3 weeks ago. And here's an example of 2 assets of an internet zone talking to your battery network. And as Michael talked about is you have to know your environment, you have to know your network. So not just what assets are in there, but what systems are talking to those important assets. And as we talk about vulnerability management, often the mitigation is not patching. you can't patch, you're not able to patch. So that network segmentation and network controls become very important. So how can you view that those network controls are in place to properly mitigate vulnerabilities in your critical OT assets that you're not able to patch? From an asset inventory point of view, a new update for the Dragos platform. So we updated our UI. A lot of feedback from customers on how they can operationalize the asset inventory to suit their purposes, how they can organize and group and filter and get a summary view and a detailed view from that. We changed how we managed assets within the platform. So now they're persistent objects, are not bound by time, which really lines up and builds the foundation for vulnerability management capability. And we're taking a different approach for vulnerability management, which I'll talk about that in just a second. We also allow you to import assets. So if you have an asset list, I think you all may have a spreadsheet lying around your environment, you can import that asset list into the Dragos platform and we'll bring it into our asset data model, including any attributes, custom attributes, or what I call non-discoverable data. Who's the asset owner? Who's the person responsible? What's their cell phone number? You can load that into our platform and have it at your fingertips if you're investigating a vulnerability or a threat. And then also new updates for bulk asset workflow. So all that is built into the UI. But really for this release, which is a big capability for us, is a vulnerability management capability built into the Dragos platform. So some of the challenges, and I think there's a lot of information that came out during the panel, is that the public vulnerability sources have incomplete or inaccurate data. Peter touched upon that from the year in review. I'll talk about that in just a second for that. OEM vendors often do not provide mitigation advice. If you have a vulnerability, but you can't patch it, how can you protect your environment? And that's the capabilities that we codify and present to you very easily and quickly within the Dragos platform. The next one I didn't write. I had this before, but James, I think, had a couple quotes. IT style active scanning is not suitable. James said, temperamental nature of the environment, not safe options for scanning, and don't feel comfortable. So I think he kind of went around the edges that don't scan your OT environment for that. And that is the challenges with that. And then lastly, vulnerability assessment without the management leaves issues untracked and gives you attack points. In fact, that's some of the question that came in the Q&A. How do you manage your vulnerabilities if you can't patch them? How do you govern the risk and understand what the risk is? And that's what we've presented for here in the Dragos platform. So a few things from the year in review, and these are some numbers that Peter had. I just want to touch down on a few of them, is that even if there is a patch, and 22% don't have a patch, but even if there is, the amount of practical mitigation advice or alternative mitigation advice is just not there. And that's a challenge in the OT environment that you don't see on the IT side for vulnerability management. On the OT environment, if the practical advice is not there, as an asset owner, what do? We present that information in Dragos. And then on top of that, the vulnerability error rate is high. So 43% of last year, OT vulnerabilities had errors. A quarter were less severe and 3/4 were more severe. And that really gives you bad guidance on how you want to manage your vulnerabilities. So for example, here's a vulnerability that came out on March 16th of this year, a Rockwell logic controller. From the NIST NVD database, the CVSS v3 was a 10.0. That is critical. That stopped the presses. That impacts business operations by trying to address this vulnerability advisory. Our expert team at Dragos looked at it, analyzed it, investigated it, and said, no, it's actually not a critical thing. We only marked it as a limited threat, and that's something you can handle next in a next window. Well, why is that? There was an error, either misrepresentation or a coding error in the vendor CVSS score. They actually have two numbers, a 10.0 and a 9.8. We corrected the score, and the Dragos corrected score, and it's a 7.5. And then we give you the other advice directly in the user interface of the Dragos platform that controllers in red mode are not affected. That if the private key has not been leaked, an adversary group has not weaponized against this vulnerability. And you get all that information to guide how and when and how much you want to do to mitigate this. And that really comes down to those 2 points. The asset information, the vulnerability information that we have from our knowledge base, and the asset information from the inventory. And our approach is starting from that core thing that's most important, your asset inventory. So we started with the Dragos platform where we have an inventory-based method to do vulnerability assessment. So with the Dragos sensor passively monitoring your environment, it will create asset inventories and update the fidelity of the asset information within the Dragos platform. New in this release, you can also upload an asset inventory list or export the asset list that we found in the sensor, update them in a spreadsheet and re-upload them to have high fidelity asset inventory. That talks about all those other use cases. And then as our knowledge pack comes out with new vulnerability catalog or knowledge base information, that creates the vulnerability detection. So that means that as your asset information gets more discovered or enriched, your vulnerability detection gets higher. So from a confidence value, you have that built into the Dragos platform. As new vulnerability information comes out, we look backward across all the asset information, and then we give you new vulnerability detections. You don't have to rescan, you don't have to reassess. It's a continuous capability within the Dragos platform. We also have a new update for the vulnerability feature that the UI maps very similar to the asset inventory. So you have the same look and feel as you pivot between the two systems. We show you the vendor CVSS score. You can show the Dragos corrected CVSS score to see if they're actually different, and many times they are. And then two things that Dragos produces unique in the industry is the risk level. It's a score of 1 to 5, or 5 is a critical on what is the criticality of this vulnerability on that asset, and then the priority that we recommend. Now, take care of this now. Next could be the next change management window, or never. These vulnerabilities cannot ever be exploited. It's impossible, so you don't have to take care of it. As I look at one of these vulnerabilities in more detail, this shows all the information from our threat intelligence and other asset information that we bring for an analyst to look at this. So this is that Rockwell Automation compact logic vulnerability. Up into the upper right, you see it's a priority next. The risk level is high. There's a CVSS score, and then we give that Dragos guidance. In this case, the vendor does have a patch, but we have alternative mitigation advice. Restrict access to these 2 ports and ensure the controllers are not directly connected to the internet. But with Dragos in this release in the platform, we overlay the vulnerability assessment with the vulnerability guidance on top of the network communications for that asset, and we present it to you. You may think, oh, we do not have systems that talk to this controller. We're okay. But in the Dragos platform, we show you, no, there's 7 assets talking to this vulnerable port and 12 assets talking to this other vulnerable port. This is a key point that you can look at to see if you do have OT, IT boundary traversals and how you can put in compensating controls. And then you can then use the Dragos platform to monitor and verify that your network mitigations are actually in place and working correctly if you're unable to patch it. And then as we go forward, vulnerability assessment is just that point in time. With Dragos in this platform release, we've given a vulnerability management capability, which is the entire life cycle. Identify, prioritize, recommend, all the things that I showed you, track remediations over time with time series data. Are you tracking down? Are vulnerabilities increasing? And then give you that reporting capability. And that really lines up with this last point of how you dispose of a vulnerability. On the IT side, the vulnerability process drives the remediation process. Not the same on OT or in the industrial side. So even though we have a capability that you can mark a vulnerability as remediated, it's no longer exists. Maybe you patched it or you decommissioned that asset, but most likely you might mark it, the vulnerability has been mitigated, that is no longer reasonably exploitable. You put in a compensated control, there's network segmentations, you put in a VLAN on your switch, and that's where that real-time visibility of access to the vulnerable ports with your compensating controls, you can get that visibility. And in some cases, and I think Sean mentioned this, that these aren't IT issues, they're actually business issues. You cannot patch the system, you cannot put in network controls, so you have to accept the risk that the operational risk outweighs the vulnerability risk, and you can mark that vulnerability for that asset as risk acceptance. We give you a UI to do that within the platform, and you can actually put that vulnerability mitigation or acceptance reason and link to your GRC tool, link to a document where you accepted that risk and why you did that, and then use the Dragos platform to monitor for any threats against that risk, or monitoring if there's any compensating controls you do put in place, maybe impact your operational environment. So that really is that last life cycle tracking for the vulnerability management. So we have the most accurate and corrected ICS vulnerability intelligence in the industry. The year in review from 2020, we have the information you can download. Dragos prioritization and guidance for all detected vulnerabilities is built into the product, built into the user interface and reporting. Complete vulnerability lifecycle tracking, as I mentioned, acceptance, compensated controls, and lastly, a confidence rating to filter out noise so you can focus on what is most important to your environment, how you can downgrade risk where it's important, like James says, or maybe increase the risk if it's important for your operations. So keep the questions coming. We'll follow up with that. And with that, I'll say thank you for the entire team. And then Peter, if you want to wrap up.
No, thank you, Chris. Thanks, Chris. That was terrific. We're out of time. So thanks to everybody for attending, our panelists, and everybody who participated. You get a follow-up email with the slides and a recording. Thank you. Goodbye.